My daughter called me at 2 in the morning. Her voice was slurred, trembling with a terror that froze the blood in my veins. "Dad, please come get me," she whispered. When I arrived at her in-law's wealthy estate, her mother-in-law physically blocked the front door. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "She is not leaving. I am a retired construction contractor who spent a lifetime breaking through concrete and steel. No wooden door and no arrogant woman was going to keep me from my little girl." I forced my way in, and what I saw on that bedroom floor made my blood boil. My name is Gerald Whitlow. I am 70 years old. For over 4 decades, I worked as a commercial construction contractor right here in Illinois. I spent my life dealing with blueprints, load-bearing walls, and cold, hard steel. I'm a man who thinks in terms of logic and structure. You have to be one miscalculation, and a 50-story building comes down around you. I stepped away from all of it a few years back, hoping to settle into something quieter after losing my beloved wife, Carolyn, to a brutal illness a decade ago. Carolyn was the beating heart of everything we built as a family. When she passed, she left behind a secret trust fund for our only daughter, Natalie. Welcome back to Dad Revenge, the place where fathers' stories get told with full honesty and nothing held back. If these stories have ever made you feel something real, I would appreciate it if you stuck around and hit subscribe. It means more than you know. Before we get into today's story, I want to ask whatever corner of the world you are sitting in right now. What is the weather like outside your window? Sometimes the coldest days are when we need a story about a father who refused to quit the most. A quick note before we begin: some elements of this story have been dramatized for the purposes of audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real individuals or events is entirely coincidental. What matters here is the truth at the heart of it. Natalie is 32 years old, a pediatric nurse, the kind who genuinely loves every child who comes through her ward. Her husband is Preston Drummond, a 35-year-old investment banker with a downtown office and a resume built to impress. Polished, successful, charming. His mother, Vivian Drummond, was born into the kind of old money that breeds a particular brand of arrogance the Indian Hill set Cincinnati's upper crust. The two of them lived in an enormous, secluded estate that felt more like a gallery than a place where real people ate breakfast. I never belonged in their universe of charity galas and country club memberships, and I knew it. But Natalie looked content, so I bit my tongue and smiled. I raised my daughter to find the best in everyone she meets. The hard truth is that some people simply have no best to find. It began on a bitterly cold Tuesday evening. I had been deep asleep in my quiet, empty house when my cell phone screamed to life on the nightstand. The clock read exactly 2:00 in the morning. At my age, nothing ringing at that hour ever turns out to be good news. I picked up on the first ring. The voice on the other end was barely audible, a strained, broken whisper. Natalie. But it did not sound like her. Her words bled into each other, thick and dragging, like a woman fighting to hold on to consciousness. "Natalie, sweetheart, what's going on?" I was already upright, pulse slamming against my chest. "Dad, please come get me." She managed the words, strangled with a terror so raw it was almost physical. "They will not let me." And then came a dull impact, a choked sound, and silence. Absolute silence. I called her name into the deadline. Nothing. There was no debate, no hesitation, no moment of standing there wondering what to do. Any man who has ever run a job site knows when the alarm goes off, you do not stand around forming a committee. You move. I was out from under the blankets in seconds, pulled on my heavy wool overcoat, and was behind the wheel of my truck before the house alarm had time to reset itself. I opened my safe and retrieved my legally registered firearm, not because I wanted to use it, but because a man who has spent his life managing risk does not walk into an unknown situation unprepared. It went into the glove box. Whatever waited for me out there, I was going to get my daughter back. Indian Hill is normally a 40-minute drive from my house. I got there in 25. The roads were bare and glazed with frost, and I pushed the truck as hard as it would go. Natalie does not drink. She has never touched drugs in her life. The most grounded, steady person I have ever known, and that slurred, terrified voice did not square with anything I understood about who she was. At 2:45 in the morning, my headlights cut across the heavy iron gates of the Drummond estate. They were standing wide open. I pulled straight up the long, curving drive and cut the engine hard in front of those massive double doors. The entire property sat in darkness, every window black, save for a single faint glow burning on the second floor. Natalie and Preston's room. I did not touch the doorbell. I beat on that front door with both fists like a man trying to knock a structure off its foundation. When it finally opened, Vivian Drummond was standing in the frame. Any reasonable person dragged from sleep at 3:00 in the morning looks rough hair, tangled eyes, unfocused, whatever they grabbed to throw on. Not Vivian. She was dressed, blouse-pressed, expensive slacks, hair set, full makeup in place. She had not been in bed. She had been sitting there waiting, knowing something was coming. Gerald, what on earth is the meaning of this disturbance? Her voice had the temperature of a marble countertop, cold, precise, utterly unmoved. Shaike, where is my daughter? I stepped toward the door. Vivian planted herself in the gap, arms folded, a thin smirk pulling at the corner of her mouth. Natalie is having a severe mental episode, she said, her tone smooth as polished wood. No worry in her expression. None. She's completely hysterical. Preston gave her something to calm her down, and she's resting now. She does not need to be disturbed. I'd suggest you go home, Gerald. You are embarrassing yourself. I looked at this woman, wealthy, entitled, practiced in dismissal, and the lie coming off her was so thick I could almost smell it. I did not request her permission. I put my shoulder into it and pushed past her. She stumbled back into the foyer wall and shrieked as though I had committed a crime against civilization. You cannot barge in here like this. Watch me, I said, and I was already on the staircase. I went up 2 at a time, her voice rising and echoing below me like something I'd already forgotten. Down the second-floor hall, straight to the master suite. Locked. 30 years of sledgehammers and demo work have a way of staying with a man. I planted my boot just under the handle and drove it through. The wood gave a sharp crack and the door burst inward. What I walked into stopped the air in my lungs. The room had been torn apart. Lamps on their sides, silk sheets ripped and heaped on the floor. And on the cold tile of the bathroom floor, my daughter, Natalie. I went to my knees next to her before I had even finished taking in the scene. She was completely unresponsive, her body gone slack, her breathing so thin it barely moved her chest. But what stopped my heart were her arms. In the hard light of that bathroom, I could see bruises, dark, deep-shaped, unmistakably like a pair of hands. Someone had gripped her with everything they had and held her down. I have spent my career understanding how force works, how weight and pressure behave. These were not accident marks. These were restraint marks. I had not even reached for her wrist to check her pulse when I heard boots hammering down the hallway. Preston crashed into the doorway, eyes jumping between the wreckage of the door and my face chest heaving. Silk pajama pants? Cashmere sweater, not a crease in it. For a man who had supposedly been startled out of sleep by an intruder, his hair sat perfectly in place. He was not panting from fear. He was winded from something else entirely. For just a fraction of a second, Before he arranged his expression into something resembling shock, I saw the truth in his eyes. Guilt, clean and unmistakable. Call an ambulance. Now. My voice came out low and hard enough to rattle the frames on the walls. Preston lifted his hands, trying to slow me down. Gerald, please, there's no reason to bring emergency services into this. I've already had my mother reach Dr. Colton, our private physician. He handles sensitive family matters quietly. There's no need for this to become a spectacle. I stood there looking at him. My daughter was on the marble floor behind me, barely breathing, the color draining from her face. And this man was talking about spectacle. She is not breathing right, I told him, crossing the room toward him. You call 911 right now, or I swear to God, Preston, I will break your jaw. His jaw set. He did not move. You're not thinking straight, Gerald. You don't know what's really going on here. Natalie had a severe episode. If paramedics come, they'll put her on a psychiatric hold that ends her nursing license. It destroys our family's name. Dr. Colton is already on his way. Back up and let me handle my own wife. Then he put his hand on my shoulder. That was the end of the conversation. 4 decades of real physical work, steel concrete weight and strain, have left their mark on a man's body in ways that no amount of investment banking and gym memberships can replicate. I took hold of his cashmere sweater, twisted it in my fist, and drove him backward into the hallway wall. Preston went down hard over the pieces of the busted door, the wind slamming out of him on impact. Don't touch me, I said quietly. And don't tell me how to look after my own child. I went back to Natalie. Crouching over her, the bruises looked worse, up-close finger-width channels pressed deep into her skin, a map of someone's grip. A story of a person held against their will. I worked my arms beneath her, one hand under her knees, one at her back, and lifted. She weighed almost nothing. She lay completely still against my chest, and something cracked open inside me because I had carried her exactly this way before. A little girl worn out from an afternoon at the park, dead asleep in her father's arms, trusting completely that she was safe. That beautiful memory made the fire in my chest burn hotter. I carried Natalie out into the hallway, and Vivian was already stationed at the top of the grand staircase, her face tight with fury, those manicured fingers wrapped white-knuckled around the banister. You are making a terrible mistake, Gerald, she hissed. You are ripping this family apart over a simple misunderstanding. I did not dignify that with a word. I walked my daughter down those stairs through the heavy front doors and laid her across the back seat of my truck. I buckled her in and pulled my heavy wool overcoat over her trembling body. I was just reaching for the driver's door when Preston threw himself into the passenger seat. If you're taking her, I'm coming. His chest was heaving, his voice all forced urgency. I am her husband. I have the legal right to be there. I had no time to wrestle him out of the cab. Every second Natalie went without medical attention was a second we could not afford. I slammed the truck into drive and tore out of that winding driveway, the iron gates of the Drummond estate shrinking in my mirrors. The run to Riverside General Hospital was a tight, airless blur. I hammered through every speed limit while Preston sat rigid in the darkness beside me, his thumbs working furiously over his phone screen. When I skidded to a stop at the emergency doors, I had Natalie in my arms before the engine finished ticking, shouting for help as I shouldered through the entrance. A team of nurses converged with a gurney and took her from me. Then, before I could get a single word out to explain what had happened, a figure emerged from a side office, tall white coat, spotless, walking with the kind of unhurried confidence that reads as arrogance once you know what you are looking at. I clocked his badge immediately. Dr. Colton. He walked straight past me as though I were furniture and went directly to Preston. Preston, your mother called me, he said, his voice pitched low, almost conversational. far too relaxed for a woman barely breathing in the next room. I have a private trauma room prepared. We will keep this contained. I moved between them. I want a full blood panel run right now, I told Dr. Colton, holding his gaze without blinking. I want every substance in her system documented, and I want those bruises on her arms formally examined. Dr. Colton looked at me the way a certain kind of man looks at someone he has already decided does not matter. Mr. Whitlow, I can assure you the standard of care here is beyond reproach. That said, Preston is her legal next of kin. Her treatment plan will be discussed with him, not with you. He gave a small nod, and 2 large security guards materialized behind him, like they had been waiting in the walls. Please make your way to the family area. The trauma room is restricted. They moved forward, planting themselves between Natalie and me like a physical wall. I understood the geometry of the situation immediately. If I pushed back and got myself arrested, Natalie would be left completely alone with these people. I swallowed what was rising in my throat and stepped back. The waiting area was all hard plastic chairs and humming fluorescent light. Through a narrow window panel down the corridor, I could just make out the monitors blinking inside Natalie's room. I sat down, put my elbows on my knees, and let my mind run the only process it knew. I started building the structure. 4 decades in commercial construction teaches you to read stress. You learn to spot the hairline fracture in a concrete slab before it opens up beneath you. You learn that when a steel beam starts to fail, the damage follows a specific, readable pattern. Physical evidence does not have an agenda. People manufacture stories. The structural damage always records what actually happened. I closed my eyes and walked back through what I had seen. The bruising on Natalie's arms, the placement of the thumb, marks the deep contusions pressed into the soft tissue along her inner biceps. A stairway fall produces random trauma. Scraped elbows, defensive marks across the forearms where someone tries to catch herself in a fall. Natalie had none of that. What she had were targeted compression points, bilateral, deliberate, the signature of someone held flat by sustained downward force. The story Vivian and Preston were building had a rotten foundation. I could feel it the same way I can feel a bad load-bearing wall just by pressing on the surface. An hour passed. The clock on the waiting room wall moved like it was dragging something heavy. Then the trauma unit doors swung open, and Dr. Colton came toward me, silver clipboard in hand. Preston was on his feet, instantly rubbing at his eyes to manufacture a fresh coat of grief. Dr. Colton stopped in front of us and arranged his face into the standard-issue mask of clinical sympathy. Gerald. He began, first name uninvited. We have stabilized Natalie's vitals, but I have to be candid with you. This situation is very serious. He extended the clipboard, not toward me, but directly to Preston. I leaned across and read the heading printed in red at the top of the page. Rapid Toxicology Report. Natalie's blood work shows a highly dangerous combination of anti-anxiety medication and a substantial quantity of alcohol. Dr. Colton explained, his eyes staying on Preston the whole time. Her system is severely compromised. Frankly, it is remarkable that her heart kept beating. The moment those words landed, Preston folded. He dropped into the nearest chair, face buried in both hands, shoulders convulsing, as a loud, theatrical sob rolled out of him and bounced off the linoleum walls. I am so sorry. He wept, the performance precise and polished. I knew the stress at the clinic was getting to her, but I never imagined it had gone this far. I tried to get the pills away from her. I tried to hold her down. I failed her. I failed to stop her from trying to end her life. I stood in that corridor under the cold fluorescent lights, the toxicology report in my hands, and I watched Preston cry without producing a single tear. His face was buried in those expensive cashmere sleeves, his performance echoing off the linoleum floors below us. I did not move toward him. I waited. After a carefully measured interval, Preston drew a shuddering breath and looked up at me. His eyes were bone dry. "Gerald, I did not want to have this conversation." He began, his voice dropping to a low confessional murmur. "I was trying to protect her privacy, but Natalie has been coming apart for months now. The weight of what she carries at that pediatric clinic, watching those children suffer, losing some of them, it hollowed her out. She started having severe panic attacks in October. Trouble sleeping at first, then it escalated. She was drinking in secret to get through it, hiding bottles of wine at the back of her closet under her winter clothes, where she thought I would never look." I kept my face perfectly flat. I let him talk. When a contractor uses inferior materials and tries to hide them behind drywall, you do not stop him midway through. You let him finish. Then you pull down the wall and show everyone what is behind it. I had spent a career learning to hear the groan of steel that is about to give. Preston gestured toward the closed trauma room doors, his expression straining toward desperate. "Tonight it came to a head," he said. "She was completely gone, screaming that she could not take it anymore. She swallowed a fistful of pills and chased them with half a bottle of cheap Merlot. When I tried to step in, she went for the bedroom window on the second floor. She was going to throw herself out onto the concrete. Gerald. I had to take her down. I had to pin her arms to the floor with my full weight, just to keep her from going through that glass. That is where every one of those bruises came from. I was trying to save her life. Before I could begin pulling apart the structural failures riddling that story, the sharp, measured click of heels announced Vivian Drummond. She came down the hospital corridor looking every bit as composed as she had in her own doorway hours earlier, designer bag, immaculate hair, an expression of deep and carefully constructed grief. She walked straight to me and laid one perfectly manicured hand on my forearm. "Oh, Gerald." Vivian breathed, her voice weighted with manufactured sorrow. "This is a tragedy for every one of us. We are absolutely devastated to see her like this. We have been trying for so long to connect Natalie with the psychiatric support she needs. But addiction does not announce itself. It takes someone we recognize and turns them into a person we no longer know." She reached into her handbag and pressed something into my palm. I looked down. It was a prescription pill bottle. The printed label bore my daughter's name in plain type. Natalie Whitlow Drummond. Below that, the medication was listed in bold, unsparing letters. Alprazolam 2 mg. The prescription had been written exactly 3 weeks earlier, signed by Dr. Colton himself. "I wanted you to see this so you could understand the full picture," Vivian murmured, sliding back to stand shoulder to shoulder with her son. "We did not want to burden you with her daily struggles. We know how deeply you love her, and we did not want you forming harsh judgments about your only daughter's unfortunate weakness. She has been quietly self-medicating for several months now. Tonight was simply the inevitable breaking point we had all been dreading. We are just profoundly grateful that Preston was there to stop her from doing the unthinkable." My calloused thumb moved over the smooth plastic of the bottle. Inside my head, heavy gears were engaging, clicking into alignment one by one. The story they had constructed was exceptionally clean, immaculately neat, every edge squared off, every corner tucked in. A devoted pediatric nurse, cracking under the weight of loss, reaching for wine and pills to manage her grief. A heroic husband diving in at the last breath to prevent tragedy. It was precisely the kind of polished narrative that the Indian Hill crowd savored over drinks at their charity events. A story engineered from the ground up to generate sympathy for Preston and Vivian while quietly dismantling my daughter's credibility and branding her as an unstable liability. I looked from Vivian to Preston, my expression a wall that gave away absolutely nothing. I slipped the pill bottle into my jacket pocket without a word. If they were handing me physical evidence, I was going to hold every piece of it. "I need to see her right now," I said, my voice low, gravelly, and dangerously controlled. "I need to speak with the attending physician about moving her to a different facility for an independent second opinion." Preston's relaxed posture snapped rigid. The grieving husband evaporated on the spot, replaced without delay by the cold, calculating presence of a man who spent his days at a deal table. He reached into his blazer's inner breast pocket and produced a thick sheaf of legal documents stamped in official blue notary ink. "That will not be happening, Gerald." His tone had the texture of poured concrete, hard, dense, unyielding. "I am her legally wedded husband, and I hold her comprehensive medical proxy. All healthcare decisions are mine to make exclusively." He pushed the documents toward my chest. I looked down at the heading. It was a standard spousal proxy, granting Preston total uncontested authority over Natalie's physical and psychiatric care. The signature at the bottom was shaky, but unmistakably hers. "Dr. Colton and I have already settled on the appropriate course of treatment." Preston went on, stepping in closer to press his advantage. "Natalie requires immediate intensive psychiatric care in a controlled environment. A public hospital cannot provide the level of security and privacy she needs right now. I have arranged private medical transport. She will be moved to Whispering Ridge Wellness Retreat tonight. You have no legal standing to prevent me from transferring my wife, and we both know it. You have no power here." Those legal papers felt like a concrete wall dropping onto my chest. Every contractor instinct I own told me to grab him by the collar, shred the documents, and carry my daughter straight out of that building. The blood was hammering in my ears. Every fiber in my body wanted to fight to knock this smug, manicured man off his feet and take apart everything he had so carefully assembled. But I looked past his shoulder. The two security guards had shifted their weight-forward hands near their radios. Dr. Colton stood to the side, one finger hovering close to the hospital panic button. I ran the calculation in under a second. One punch, just one, and I would be in handcuffs and hauled out of the emergency room while Natalie disappeared into the back of a private van with no one left to ask questions. That was the architecture of the trap they had built. They were not just hoping I would explode, they were counting on it. They needed the violent, unhinged father to validate every word of their story. I pulled in a long, deliberate breath. I made myself open my fists, pressing my fingers flat against my thighs. I had to build a bridge to get through this, even a temporary one. I had to play a part I had never rehearsed in 70 years. The defeated old man, the broken father who had finally run out of fight. I let my shoulders drop, softened my posture, made myself look smaller than I was. I let out a slow, trembling exhale, my chin falling. "You are right, Preston," I said, threading just enough shake into my voice to sound demolished. "You are her husband. The proxy is yours. I'm just a scared old father who panicked when the phone rang at 2:00 in the morning. I don't know anything about psychiatric care or treatment plans. I saw my daughter on that floor, and I completely lost my head." Preston unwound immediately. The defensive rigidity drained out of him, replaced by the loose posture of a man who believes he has just won. He folded the documents back into his blazer, smoothed his lapels with a practiced hand. "I'm glad you're being reasonable, Gerald," he said, his voice settling into that patronizing register men like him keep reserved for people they consider beneath them. "This is a layered, complicated medical situation. It demands a careful, sophisticated approach. not a blunt instrument. Vivian moved forward, a quiet smile of triumph, pulling at the corners of her mouth. She placed her hand on my shoulder, the touch landing like something cold and dead. "We understand how hard this is for you to absorb, Gerald," she said softly, her voice bouncing off the sterile corridor walls. "But you have to trust that we are doing what is right for this family. Natalie is a Drummond now. We protect our own. Go home. Rest. Let us handle what needs to be handled." I gave a slow, deliberate nod, keeping my eyes pointed at the floor. "I'll step back," I murmured, forcing each word past my teeth. "I'll let you manage her recovery. Just please keep me informed about how she is doing." "Of course," Preston said smoothly, the lie sliding out of him without friction. "The facility will be in touch once she is stable enough for visitors. Given the severity of her condition, that could be a matter of weeks." At that precise moment, the emergency room's double doors parted. Two broad-shouldered men in dark, unmarked uniforms pushed a specialized transport gurney through the entrance. Nothing about them read standard hospital staff. They had the bearing of private security contractors. Dr. Colton intercepted them, spoke in low tones, then led them straight into the trauma room. I stood in the waiting area, something fracturing in my chest as those men wheeled Natalie out. She was fully restrained, heavy leather straps crossing her chest and legs. An oxygen mask covered her pale face, an IV line taped to the back of her bruised hand. She looked impossibly small, hollowed out by whatever sedatives were moving through her blood. Preston and Vivian walked alongside the gurney, murmuring instructions to the transport crew. They did not look back at me once as they guided my unconscious daughter through the sliding glass doors and out into the freezing Cincinnati night. I watched through the window as they loaded her into a sleek black van. No flashing lights, no hospital markings. A ghost vehicle built for making people disappear without a trace. The doors sealed shut, the engine turned over, and the van was swallowed by the dark. I was alone in the hollow quiet of the hospital lobby. The satisfaction they felt in that moment must have been enormous. They believed they had neutralized the inconvenient blue-collar father and cleared the board. What they failed to account for was what I had spent 4 decades doing for a living. I had built a career on walking into structures raised on flawed foundations and finding every hidden crack. They had handed me a blueprint assembled entirely from lies, and I was going to take it apart piece by piece. I walked out to my truck boots grinding against the frost-covered asphalt. The drive home unspooled as a series of streetlights and dark stretches I barely registered. The silence inside the cab sat on me like weight. My mind churned through a torrent of images I could not shut off. The bruises on Natalie's arms. Vivian's flawless makeup at 3:00 in the morning. Preston's dry theatrical grief. The swift, soundless arrival of that unmarked transport van. By the time I finally turned into my driveway, the sky had begun to pale at the edges, a thin gray light settling over the neighborhood. I let myself in through the front door and walked into the suffocating silence of my house. The air pressed down on me. I went straight to the kitchen, running on nothing but muscle memory. Water into the coffee pot grounds into the filter finger on the button. The machine began its steady drip, the only sound in the entire building. I leaned against the counter with my full weight, pressing the heels of my hands against my eyes. When I finally lifted my gaze, it drifted across the room and settled on the wooden mantel above the living room fireplace. Centered on that mantel was a framed photograph from Natalie's nursing school graduation. She stood between Carolyn and me, grinning with everything she had, her crisp uniform catching the light. I crossed the room and lifted the heavy silver frame. I looked at those bright, knowing eyes. I thought about the day she walked across that stage. I thought about the celebratory dinner we had at an expensive steakhouse downtown and the way she laughed when she raised her glass for a toast. Then something hit me, a discrepancy so stark and so obvious that the force of it sent me stumbling backward. The frame slipped from my hands and landed on the carpet. Preston had stood in that hospital corridor and built me a story brick by brick. He looked me in the face and said Natalie had been concealing bottles of wine in her closet, that she had swallowed a fistful of anxiety pills and washed them down with half a bottle of cheap Merlot to dull the pain. That story was the entire load-bearing foundation of his suicide narrative, but Natalie is severely allergic to sulfites. The memory was sharp and absolute. She was 18 years old at a family wedding, and she took a single sip of red wine. Within 10 minutes, her throat began closing. Hives spread across her skin, and we rushed her to the emergency room for an epinephrine injection. The doctors told her clearly that even a small glass of wine risked triggering fatal anaphylactic shock. Natalie understood that better than most people ever could. She was a brilliant pediatric nurse with a command of pharmacology that most laypeople never develop. She had not had a drop of wine in 14 years. She would not, under any circumstance, in any state of mind, have drunk half a bottle of Merlot. It would have stopped her heart before the pills had time to work. The whole story was a fabrication. The wine, the pills, the suicide attempt, all of it a carefully staged production. And those bruises on her arms were never defensive marks from a husband pulling his wife back from a window. They were restraint marks. They had pinned her down. They had forced those pills into her. My breathing came harder, my chest fighting to keep up, as the full shape of what had happened locked into place. My daughter did not have a breakdown. She was assaulted in her own home. She was poisoned by people who lived under the same roof and smiled at her across the dinner table. And now she was sealed inside a private facility where no one on the outside could reach her. I stood in the living room as the early light slowly worked its way across the floorboards. Every trace of grief and confusion burned away. What replaced it was cold, precise, terrible in its clarity. Preston and Vivian Drummond believed they had closed the book on this. They had neutralized the problem and tucked it away where it could not cause trouble. They had written me off as a worn-out old man who would shuffle home, take a pill, and go back to sleep. They had made a catastrophic error. I know how to build. I also know with equal precision how to bring something down. I reached into my coat pocket and took out the small orange pill bottle Vivian had pressed into my hand. I squeezed it in my fist until the plastic gave. They wanted to fight this battle in the dark. They were going to find out what that meant. I moved toward the hall closet to grab my coat, then stopped. My hand hovered near the door. Charging back out without a plan was the move of an amateur. Every contractor knows you do not pick up a sledgehammer before you have studied the blueprints. Preston and Vivian were operating behind walls of money and private security. If I showed up at that wellness retreat right now, I would be removed from the property in handcuffs and handed the perfect excuse to keep me away permanently. I needed leverage first. I needed to understand what was actually holding their structure upright. I turned and walked down the dark hallway to my private study. Oak shelves, filing cabinets packed with decades of construction permits the accumulated paper trail of a working life. I went straight to the corner of the room and knelt on the worn rug, peeling back the heavy braided rug to expose the solid steel floor safe beneath it. I put that safe in myself 20 years ago, poured the concrete casing by hand so nothing could ever compromise it. I set my fingers on the cold dial and worked through the combination 27 to the right, 15 to the left, 63 to the right. The locking bolts drew back with a solid final thud. I reached past old property deeds, retirement portfolios, and military discharge papers until my fingers found a thick, sealed manila envelope. I carried it to the mahogany desk and sat down. My hands were not entirely steady as I untied the string closure. Inside were the financial documents Carolyn had assembled before the illness took her. Carolyn was a careful, deliberate woman. She had come into a significant inheritance from her family and kept it entirely separate from my construction business always. She used to say that money was either a stepping stone or an anchor, and the difference came down entirely to the character of whoever was holding it. Before she died, she set up an ironclad trust fund for Natalie. It was built to last, overseen by a tough financial attorney named Fielding, and it carried one specific, unbreakable condition. I spread the legal papers across the desk and dragged my finger down through the dense columns of language until I reached the final page. The numbers beside Carolyn's elegant signature stopped me cold. The trust had been seeded with $4 million. Over the decades since, through carefully managed market investments, it had grown. The current valuation stood at exactly $8 million. I moved to the access clause. Natalie was the sole beneficiary, but not a penny of the principal could be touched until she reached full maturity. The trust unlocked on her 32nd birthday. I sat back and stared at the dark window. My pulse settled into a slow, heavy rhythm. I ran the dates. Natalie had turned 32 exactly 14 days ago. This was not a coincidence. In construction, when a pipe fails the same day, someone cranks up the water pressure, you already know who touched the valve. For 3 years, Preston had played the devoted, attentive husband without a single sign of the behavior I had now seen up close. But exactly 2 weeks after my daughter came into legal access to $8 million in liquid assets, she was poisoned, physically restrained, and locked inside a private facility where her husband held total legal authority over her existence. Preston was not trying to treat Natalie. He was trying to have her declared mentally incompetent. With a medical proxy already in hand, he could go before a judge and petition for financial conservatorship, claiming the funds were needed to cover her long-term psychiatric care. The carefully constructed story of addiction and breakdown was the exact foundation that argument required. He intended to steal her inheritance, and he was willing to put her through whatever it took to make the paperwork stick. I sat in my desk chair and let the full, staggering ugliness of it settle over me. I needed to reach Fielding. The trust had to be frozen before Preston could get conservatorship papers in front of a judge. I pulled my cell phone from my coat pocket and woke the screen. As I moved to search for Fielding's number, a small red notification icon caught my attention. The voicemail indicator. One unheard message. I frowned and tapped it. I am an old man, and I do not always keep up with the way these devices handle notifications. I have swiped things away without meaning to more times than I can count. I checked the details on the missed call. It was from Natalie. The timestamp showed it had come in 3 days ago, right in the middle of a busy Tuesday afternoon, when I'd been running loud power tools out in my garage workshop. I'd missed it completely. I pressed the phone hard against my ear, my breath hitching in my throat, as the automated voice read off the date and time. Then a burst of static crackled through the speaker, and Natalie's voice came through. She didn't sound slurred or sedated the way she had tonight. She sounded sharp alert and unmistakably terrified. She was whispering fast, and in the background I could hear the distinct click of a door being locked. "Dad, it's me!" She breathed, her voice trembling with raw, unfiltered panic. "Call me back the absolute second you get this. Do not text me. Call me." Something is seriously wrong with Preston. He has been locking himself in his home office for days on end, screaming at people over the phone about offshore margins and missing capital. I found bank statements tucked inside his briefcase. "Dad, I think he is completely bankrupt. He has been forging my signature on small loan applications." She stopped, pulling in a ragged, shaking breath. I could feel the terror vibrating right through the tiny speaker. This morning, he asked me to move my trust fund into a joint corporate account. He called it a temporary investment, but his eyes were ice cold. When I told him I needed to speak with Fielding first, he completely lost it. He hurled a glass against the wall. I have never seen him like that. I told him I'm calling my lawyer and filing for financial separation. I need you to find Mom's original death certificate and the primary trust documents from your safe. I need to prove the money is mine alone. Dad, please. I am scared to be in this house with him right now. Call me. The voicemail cut off with a sharp beep. I set the phone down, slowly resting it on top of the $8 million trust document. The whole picture was now complete. Every jagged piece locked into place. Natalie had uncovered Preston's financial ruin. She had refused to surrender her inheritance, and she had threatened him with divorce. Preston was cornered, staring down absolute bankruptcy and the humiliating collapse of his privileged social standing. He couldn't get her to sign the money over willingly. So he and his ruthless mother had fallen back on their horrific contingency plan. They chose to silence her. They sedated her with drugs, manufactured a suicidal breakdown, and shipped her off to a private facility to disappear, clearing the way for a hostile legal seizure of her entire estate. My daughter was a financial hostage. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, and the raw, violent rage inside me underwent a transformation. It hardened into something cold, methodical, and calculating. I wasn't going to simply react. I wasn't going to hand them what they wanted by throwing punches and landing myself in handcuffs. That was their game plan. They wanted the loud, unsophisticated contractor to blow his top and make a scene. Instead, I was going to do what I'd done throughout my entire professional life. I was going to secure the perimeter, bring in my crew, and systematically tear their world apart. I was going to strip their polished, wealthy facade down to bare dirt, and I was going to pull my daughter free from the rubble. I picked up the phone and scrolled past Fielding's name. I needed a lawyer, yes, but first I needed a demolition expert. Someone who knew how to work in the shadows well outside the polite, restrictive limits of the law. I dialed a number I hadn't called in over 5 years. It rang 3 times before a gruff, weary voice picked up. "Rupert, it's Gerald," I said, keeping my voice level in the dark study. "I need your help. I've got a structural collapse on my hands, and I need a man who knows how to move through the rubble." The gruff voice let out a low chuckle. "Tell me where and when, Gerald." I told him we'd meet later that evening, then ended the call. Rupert was a retired police detective turned private investigator. We'd worked together years back when a corrupt supplier tried to scam my construction firm. He knew how to excavate dirt buried beneath layers of corporate shell companies. But before I unleashed him on Preston and Vivian, I needed to walk straight into the belly of the beast and witness the panic firsthand. By 9 the following morning, I had pulled a thick folder of Natalie's childhood medical records from my filing cabinet. It was the perfect cover for an unannounced visit. I drove downtown to the towering glass skyscraper that housed Preston's prestigious investment firm. The building was an architectural showpiece engineered to project absolute transparency and enormous wealth. I knew better. The buildings with the most glass almost always had the darkest basements. I took the elevator to the 42nd floor. The reception area of Drummond Capital Investments was designed to intimidate. The floors were polished marble, and the walls were paneled in rich walnut. A sharply dressed receptionist sat behind an enormous desk. I walked toward her, letting my shoulders sag, playing the part of the worn-down, grieving father without missing a beat. "Excuse me, miss," I said, roughing up my voice just slightly. "I'm Gerald Whitlow Preston's father-in-law. I don't have an appointment, but I brought some urgent medical records for my daughter Natalie." Preston needs these for the clinic she was admitted to last night. The receptionist looked up, her expression melting into immediate sympathy. Oh, Mr. Whitlow, I'm so sorry to hear about your daughter. Mr. Drummond has been absolutely devastated all morning. He asked us to hold his calls, but since this is a medical matter, I'll let him know you're here. Please wait in the corridor outside his office suite. It's the last door on the right. She gestured down a quiet hallway. I thanked her and moved slowly in the direction she indicated. The carpet swallowed my footsteps whole. As I neared the final mahogany door, I noticed it was sitting fractionally ajar no more than an inch. I stopped cold. I didn't take one of the waiting chairs. Instead, I moved closer to that narrow gap, pressing my back flat against the wall and holding my breath. Inside the office, Preston was not weeping over his ailing wife. He was screaming. I don't care what you have to tell the auditors. Preston hissed, his voice shaking with manic, frantic energy. You move that capital before the end of the day. If those margin calls land on my desk tomorrow morning, we are done. Do you understand me? You bury this deficit. You hide it inside the shell accounts we opened in Delaware. Just buy me 72 hours. A loud crash rang out from inside the room, something heavy shattering against a hard surface. Don't tell me it's impossible. Preston roared, his polished composure gone entirely. Foreclosure notices are already sitting in my inbox. If the board discovers I've been using client funds to cover my own catastrophic losses, I'm looking at federal prison. You stall them until Friday. My chest went tight. Every word was a direct echo of Natalie's frantic voicemail. Preston had embezzled millions of dollars, and his entire world was coming apart at the seams. Then a second voice cut through the tension. It was sharp, venomous, and disturbingly calm. Vivian. Get a hold of yourself, Preston. She snapped, her tone dripping with contempt. Screaming at subordinates isn't going to solve anything. You're behaving like a frightened child. We have a solid, airtight plan, and you're going to destroy it with your panic. I peered through the gap. Vivian was moving back and forth across the extravagant office like a predator working a cage. The money is there. Vivian continued, dropping her voice to a firm, measured whisper. Natalie's trust fund is fully matured. $8 million in untraceable liquid assets. More than enough to cover the deficit, clear the estate mortgage, and keep the federal auditors quiet before they open an investigation. All we need is for the judge to sign the conservatorship paperwork Friday morning. Oh, I can't take this waiting. Preston groaned, sounding like a man teetering on the edge of a total collapse. What if the clinic starts asking questions? What if her father starts poking around? Vivian scoffed. Her father is an ignorant relic. He was practically in tears in the hospital waiting room. He believes every word we fed him. As for the clinic, I hold a 40% stake in that facility. The staff there knows exactly who signs their paychecks. They will not ask a single question. Just keep the girl sedated until Friday. Once the judge grants you full legal guardianship, we transfer the funds and walk away clean. If her mind deteriorates from the sedatives, it only reinforces our tragic little narrative. My blood went to ice. They were talking casually, almost clinically, about the permanent destruction of my daughter's mind as a means of burying their financial crimes. They intended to leave her a permanent, institutionalized shell. Explosive rage surged up into my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to kick that mahogany door clean off its hinges and silence his pathetic voice for good, but violence would only forfeit the game. I needed to destroy them through the law. Then the leather chair let out a squeak. Footsteps came marching toward the door. I stepped back fast, letting the manila folder slip from my hands onto the floor. The door swung open wide. Preston stood in the doorway, face flushed, deep red sweat breaking across his forehead. He went rigid the moment he spotted me crouched on the carpet. Raw, undisguised terror crossed his face. He stopped breathing, his mind racing to calculate exactly how much I'd heard. I looked up at him and shaped my expression into something between mild confusion and bone-deep exhaustion. "Oh, Preston," I sighed, letting my hands shake as I gathered the papers. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to intrude. The receptionist told me to wait out here, but I dropped the folder, clumsy old hands. I hope I didn't interrupt a business call." Preston studied my weathered face, hunting for any trace of deception. Finding nothing but the hollowed-out look of a grieving father, his panic drained away. The arrogant mask slid right back into position. He straightened his tie and manufactured a smile. "Gerald," he said, his voice thick with counterfeit warmth, "you didn't interrupt a thing. Just the usual market noise. Come in, come in." I got to my feet slowly, the medical records pressed against my chest. I played every inch the fool while the fire burning inside me ran hotter than a blast furnace. I already knew the truth. This was a financial hostage situation, and I was going to need professional backup to burn their empire to rubble. The old roadside diner smelled strongly of burnt coffee and sizzling sausage. It was a loud, wonderfully chaotic place sitting right off the busy interstate. I settled into a sticky vinyl booth in the far back corner and nursed a black coffee. Across from me sat my friend Rupert and attorney Fielding. Rupert had a gray mustache and a pair of eyes that never stopped working, the room sizing up every face. He'd spent 30 years as a police detective before hanging out his own shingle as a private investigator. Next to him sat Fielding Carolyn's financial attorney, a shark in a tailored suit, a man who cut through corporate finance with ruthless surgical precision. I laid the entire situation out on the table. I walked them through the forged narrative, the sulfite allergy discrepancy, the staged suicide attempt, and the $8 million trust fund. I told them how I'd watched private security wheel my sedated daughter into a phantom transport van. Fielding stared at the tabletop. "If Preston holds a valid medical proxy that Natalie signed willingly, we're blocked on the legal front," he said. "If we go to the police, Preston will simply wave that document in their faces. He'll claim he's making medical decisions for a spouse struggling with addiction. The authorities won't step into a private medical dispute. The law shields him completely." Rupert nodded. "Fielding's right, Gerald. If you force a wellness check, Preston's lawyers will hit you with a restraining order. They've built Natalie a legal fortress. They can hold her inside that facility, keep her medicated, and wait for Friday morning to lock down the financial conservatorship. We can't go at them head-on. We have to slip through the cracks. I need you to freeze that trust, Fielding," I said, leaning across the table. "She put a lock on that money so airtight that Preston can't pull out a single dime." "I can file an injunction on the grounds of coercion," Fielding replied, "but not until Friday morning when the courts open. If we show our hand before then, Preston's legal team will counterfile and tie this up in litigation for months. We need documented proof of his financial distress to justify the freeze." "That's where I come in," Rupert said. "I'll dig into Preston's offshore accounts and corporate shell structures. By Friday morning, I'll have a report that proves he's completely insolvent. But Gerald, we've got a serious problem. We don't know where they took Natalie. Whispering Ridge Wellness Retreat is a corporate umbrella operating a dozen private facilities across the state. We have to pin down her exact physical location before Friday, or Preston may move her to keep her hidden." I looked at the two men who were putting their careers on the line for my family. "You handle the money," I said quietly. "I'll find my daughter. But first I need to make them believe they've already won." I walked out of the warm diner and climbed into the cold cab of my truck. The freezing air bit at my lungs. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed Preston's personal number. I cleared my throat carefully, dropping my voice a full octave. I needed to sound frail, broken, and completely beaten. Preston picked up on the second ring. "Gerald," he said, his voice wrapped in fabricated, silky warmth. "How are you holding up on this terrible morning?" "Not well at all, Preston," I rasped, letting a long, shaking sigh escape. "My arthritis is flaring something awful in the cold, and my heart feels like it's in pieces. Sitting in this empty house, looking at Natalie's photographs, it's tearing me apart. I can't stop seeing her lying in that hospital bed. I feel completely useless." I could practically feel the smirk forming on Preston's face through the phone. "You've been through a tremendous shock, Gerald. Of course you feel overwhelmed. That's entirely understandable. You need to put your own health first right now. We have everything handled on our end. Natalie is getting the very best care." "I know," I whispered, squeezing every last drop of defeat into the word. "That's why I'm calling. I can't stay in this house anymore. I need to get away from everything. I'm packing the truck to head up to my old fishing cabin in northern Michigan. Completely off the grid, no cell service, no internet, just trees and silence. I'm planning to stay at least a month and just let myself grieve. I only wanted to let you know so you wouldn't worry when my calls stopped coming through." Preston couldn't keep the relief out of his voice. He sounded like a man who'd just drawn a royal flush. "Gerald, I think that is an absolutely brilliant idea. You need to unplug completely and find your peace. Don't give a single thing down here a second thought. Take a full month. Take 2 if that's what your body needs. I'll stay on top of the clinic and the doctors. You just rest. Safe travels, Gerald." He ended the call fast, clearly eager to celebrate what he believed was his final obstacle walking out of the picture. He was convinced he'd neutralized the last real threat. He thought I was pointing my truck north to sit beside a frozen lake and fall apart. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and turned the engine over. I didn't drive north toward northern Michigan. Instead, I headed straight into the Mill Creek Industrial Corridor on the edge of the city. I pulled into the lot of a massive commercial hardware supply warehouse, the kind of place that served professional contractors exclusively. I moved through the aisles with cold, mechanical purpose. I bought a cheap, untraceable prepaid burner phone and paid with crisp $100 bills. I picked up a high-definition fiber optic inspection camera with a 50-foot flexible cable, the type used to probe compromised ventilation shafts. I added a set of directional parabolic microphones, heavy-duty wire cutters, lock-picking tools, and a tactical crowbar built to force open reinforced steel doors. I loaded everything into a black canvas duffel bag. I drove out to the wealthy suburbs of Indian Hill. Exactly 1 mile from the towering iron gates of the Drummond estate, a run-down roadside motel had somehow outlasted the area's gentrification. The neon sign out front was missing half its letters. I stepped into the dingy lobby and rented a room at the far end of the property, well away from the main road. I dropped the canvas bag onto the patterned bedspread. The room carried a heavy smell of stale cigarettes and bleach. I pulled the thick blackout curtains shut, sealing out every trace of light. Then I unpacked my tools, arranging the fiber optic cables and microphones across the mattress in a clean, orderly row. I picked up the burner phone and called Rupert's secure line to pass along my new contact number. Preston and Vivian were convinced they were dealing with a beaten, ignorant old man who'd tucked his tail and retreated to hide in the woods. What they didn't know was that they had just let a master builder inside their walls. The masks had slipped, and the hunt had officially begun. I sat in the suffocating dark of that motel room until the digital clock on the nightstand turned to 8. Preston and Vivian were attending the annual Children's Foundation fundraising dinner tonight. It was a highly publicized black tie affair. They'd be flashing smiles at cameras, pressing the flesh with wealthy donors, and performing the role of the exhausted, devoted family members, coping bravely with my daughter's sudden, tragic breakdown. The hypocrisy turned my stomach, but their arrogance handed me exactly the window I needed. I dressed in dark, tactical clothing, pulled a black knit cap low over my brow, slung the canvas duffel across my chest, and slipped silently out the back door of the motel. I left the truck behind. I walked the full mile to the Drummond estate, keeping tight to the dense tree line that ran along the edge of the wealthy neighborhood. The freezing wind clawed at my face, but the cold held my mind knife-sharp. I reached the towering iron gates and skirted them entirely, moving along to the eastern perimeter wall. I knew this property the way I knew my own hands. 5 years back, when Natalie and Preston first took possession of the estate, I had personally run the entire renovation. I'd upgraded the structural supports, reinforced the foundation, and most critically, I had overseen the installation of their state-of-the-art security system myself. I knew every blind spot, every motion sensor, and every hardwired failsafe. I scaled the stone wall and dropped silently onto the frost-covered lawn. The house rose before me like a dark, brooding fortress. I moved quickly toward the utility access panel concealed behind a row of thick, evergreen bushes. With practiced precision, I drew a pair of insulated wire cutters from my bag and severed the primary fiber optic line supplying the exterior alarm perimeter. The system was engineered to roll instantly to a cellular backup, but I'd come prepared with a localized signal jammer. I thumbed the switch on the small black box in my coat pocket. The digital keypad on the back door blazed angry red for 3 seconds, then went dead. The house was now completely blind and deaf. I worked my tactical crowbar against the heavy oak door's lock, applying just enough careful upward pressure to clear the deadbolt without leaving so much as a scratch on the brass casing. I stepped inside the kitchen and eased the door shut behind me with a soft click. The silence filling that massive house was total. I didn't reach for my flashlight. I navigated entirely by the ambient moonlight pouring through the tall windows and by the architectural blueprints burned permanently into my memory. I moved through the lavish rooms with the quiet, deliberate composure of a ghost. I wasn't here to break things or give in to a violent outburst. I was here to harvest data. I went to Vivian's private parlor first. It was an opulent space hung with expensive silk curtains and furnished with antiques. I set my bag on the floor and drew out the first micro camera, no larger than a coat button, fitted with infrared night vision and a long-life battery. I stepped up onto a sturdy velvet chair, carefully unscrewed the metal grate covering the HVAC vent near the ceiling, and planted the tiny lens inside the ductwork, angling it to cover the full room. I threaded the grate back into place and wiped every surface clean with a microfiber cloth. Vivian would never think to check the vents. I moved silently down the hallway to Preston's home office. This was the true nerve center. The room carried the scent of expensive cologne and aged leather. I ran through the same process, sliding a second micro camera into the ceiling vent, positioned directly above his broad mahogany desk. Now I would see every document he handled and catch every word of every call he made. But audio and video were only half the equation. I needed hard, irrefutable financial evidence, the kind that would convince a judge that Preston was completely insolvent and unfit to control my daughter's assets. I stepped down from the vent and moved behind his desk. Preston was arrogant, but he wasn't careless. His high-end desktop was secured behind complex biometric passwords. What he didn't account for was that I had no intention of logging into his operating system. I unzipped the bag and pulled out a specialized industrial USB cloning drive. Rupert had given it to me, explaining it was built to bypass the software layer entirely and pull raw data straight off the hard drive motherboard. I plugged it into the hidden port at the back of the computer tower. A small pulsing green light lit up the dark corner of the office. The digital display on the cloning drive showed the extraction would take exactly 6 minutes. I stood in the darkness watching the progress bar inch across the tiny screen. 10%, 20%, the silence pressed in from all sides. Every creak the old house made as it settled rang in my ears like a gunshot. I kept my focus locked on that green light, counting seconds in my head. 50%, 70%, almost there. I was moments away from holding the financial blueprints that would collapse Preston's carefully constructed lies. 90%. The device hummed softly. Then a metallic click rang out through the silent house. It came from the front foyer. The deadbolt was turning. My blood went cold. I checked my watch. It was only 9:30. Preston and Vivian weren't due back until midnight. A woman's voice let out a heavy sigh somewhere in the hallway. Vivian. She'd left the gala early, bored most likely. The front door swung open, and the sharp click of her heels began tracking across the marble floors, moving in a direct line toward the home office. 98%. I fixed my eyes on the cloning drive. My chest locked tight. I couldn't pull the device before it finished. A partial extraction would corrupt the data and reduce the entire mission to nothing. Her footsteps were loud now. She was in the adjoining hallway just feet away. 100%. The small screen flashed bright green. I yanked the USB drive free, dropped it into my pocket, and grabbed the duffel. Going back out through the kitchen wasn't an option. Vivian had already cut off that route. I turned to the large glass windows behind Preston's desk. Outside, a heavy framework of industrial steel scaffolding had been erected against the rear of the house for an ongoing roof repair. I quietly unlatched the brass window lock and slid the pane up just as the office doorknob began to turn. I slipped backward through the window onto the steel platform, drew the glass down behind me, and left it open by a fraction of an inch, just as Vivian hit the overhead lights. I flattened myself against the metal grating of the scaffolding, not breathing, as her shadow swept across the curtains. The stolen data was in my pocket. The hidden cameras were invisible. Their carefully polished masks were about to be broken for good. I held myself pressed against the freezing metal, motionless, as Vivian moved around inside. Through the narrow gap in the window, I watched her shadow slide back and forth across the curtains. She paced and muttered, clearly agitated about Preston and his loss of composure, with no idea I was hovering just inches beyond the glass. I waited until she finally killed the lights, and her footsteps faded down the long hallway. When the mahogany door clicked shut, I started my descent. Coming down 3 stories of steel scaffolding in total darkness demanded focus, but my hands remembered the rhythm without thinking. I dropped into the garden, melted into the tree line, and walked back to my motel room. The stolen data drive felt like a live coal in my pocket. I plugged it into a laptop, confirmed the files were intact, and sent the raw data directly to Fielding. The financial trap was set. Now I had to focus on pulling my daughter out of their medical prison. The following morning, I met Rupert in the corner of a diner 3 towns over from the Drummond estate. Rupert slid into the booth and drew a thick folder from inside his leather jacket. His weathered face was grim, deep lines of exhaustion carved around his eyes. He'd spent the night running surveillance on the Whispering Ridge Wellness Retreat, and his findings confirmed my worst fears. "It's a genuine fortress, Gerald," Rupert said, keeping his voice low. 40 acres of private woodland surrounded by 12-foot masonry walls topped with motion sensors. The front gate is staffed by armed guards, and every entrance requires a biometric keycard. The place is built exactly like a high-end prison. They don't want anyone getting in, and they don't want anyone getting out. Fielding arrived a few minutes later and dropped into the booth. He slapped a stack of printed financial records on the table. "It's far worse than just a medical facility," Fielding said, tapping a finger against highlighted text. "I spent the night tracing the corporate ownership of Whispering Ridge. It's buried under 3 Delaware shell companies, but I found the primary shareholder. Vivian Drummond holds a 40% controlling stake in the entire operation." My stomach turned to lead as the full scale of their scheme settled over me. Vivian wasn't simply sending Natalie to some clinic for treatment. She was locking her inside her own private black site, an exclusive disposal facility, where wealthy families made inconvenient relatives vanish without public scandal. With her 40% ownership, Vivian controlled who got hired, what medications were given, and who was permitted to visit. She owned the narrative completely. I pulled a worn notebook from my pocket, my mind shifting out of anger and into structural analysis. When a building can't be breached from the front, you don't waste time at the gate. You locate the foundational weaknesses. I'd spent 40 years pulling commercial permits and studying municipal zoning layouts. I knew exactly how to find the blind spots in any architectural design. I drove to the county records office under the cover of an independent contractor inquiring about property lines. Within 2 hours, I had a complete set of blueprints for the Whispering Ridge Wellness Retreat Facility. I spread the blue sheets across the motel bed and traced the intricate web of hallways, checkpoints, and utility shafts. I found the flaw almost immediately. The clinic had recently overhauled its entire digital security perimeter, but in doing so they had neglected to address the original subterranean service entrance used for industrial laundry. The heavy steel door sat at the bottom of a sunken stairwell, hidden behind a retaining wall, placing it exactly 3 degrees outside the sweeping arc of the nearest security camera. A microscopic blind spot. But for a man who'd spent his career measuring fractions of an inch, it was a wide open door. Getting inside, though, was only half the battle. I needed someone on the inside who could actually reach Natalie. Rupert tapped his extensive network of local contacts and quickly identified our weak link. Her name was Glenda. She was a heavily indebted night shift nurse working the psychiatric ward at Whispering Ridge, drowning in overdue medical bills for her sick mother and carrying a deep, smoldering resentment toward the wealthy clinic administrators. Rupert intercepted Glenda in the dim parking lot of a discount grocery store late that evening. He didn't bother with small talk. He handed her a thick brown envelope holding exactly $10,000 in unmarked 100 bills. The instructions were simple but extraordinarily dangerous. She was to smuggle a clean, uncontaminated blood sample from my daughter out of the facility before the clinic doctors could alter her system any further. More critically, she was to slip an untraceable burner phone into Natalie's guarded room and hide it inside the mattress lining. The phone was preloaded with only my secure number. If Natalie came around, she would have a direct, invisible lifeline to the outside world. Glenda stared at that thick stack of cash in stunned silence before giving a slow, quiet nod. The waiting was absolute torture. I sat in the darkness of my motel room and stared at the glowing screen of my prepaid phone without blinking. Every minute that crawled by felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I pictured the darkened hallways of the clinic in my mind, Glenda moving carefully past the security stations with the hidden device tucked out of sight. Just past 3 a.m, the phone buzzed against the cheap wooden nightstand. A single encrypted text appeared on the screen. An image file. I opened it, my breath seizing in my throat. The dim, poorly lit photograph showed the sterile, fortified interior of a psychiatric isolation room. At the center of the frame, my daughter lay strapped to a narrow hospital bed. Thick leather restraints bound her wrists and ankles hard against the metal rails. Her skin had gone a ghastly, translucent gray, making her look like a ghost dissolving into the mattress. Her eyes were rolled back, lost somewhere beneath the crushing weight of the heavy sedatives they were pumping into her veins to keep her manageable. The dark purple bruises Preston had left on her arms stood out under the harsh fluorescent lights. I stared at the image of my incapacitated child. The role of the broken old man burned completely away, leaving nothing but cold, terrifying ash. A deep, lethal quiet settled over my mind. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't break anything. The grief had gone replaced by a ruthless, mechanical fury that sat heavier than poured concrete. Preston and Vivian Drummond thought they had won their sophisticated chess match. They believed they could cage my daughter and plunder her life without ever answering for it. I closed the phone and picked up my tactical crowbar, feeling the cold weight of the steel in my palm. The time for gathering evidence was drawing to a close. They had built a vast, fraudulent empire on the broken back of my only child, and I was going to reduce every last piece of it to rubble. I left the suffocating confines of my motel room before the sun cleared the horizon. I carried my duffel bag and the cloned USB drive straight to an abandoned warehouse on the outer edge of the Mill Creek Industrial Corridor. Rupert had commandeered the empty office space on the second floor and converted it into a secure, off-the-grid command center. When I pushed through the heavy metal door, the room was lit by the hard blue glow of several computer monitors. Fielding was already there alongside Rupert's sleeves rolled to his elbows, expensive silk tie hanging loose around his neck. The two of them looked like generals mapping out a siege. I dropped the USB drive onto the folding table. The metallic clatter rang through the cavernous room. "I need you to tear this apart," I said. Rupert snatched the drive and plugged it into a heavily encrypted laptop. His fingers moved fast across the keyboard, punching through lines of complex code to dismantle the residual security firewalls Preston had installed. The room sank into a tense, heavy silence, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of keys and the low hum of the processor. We watched the decryption software grind through the stolen data. Nearly an hour of agonizing waiting passed before the progress bar finally hit 100%. The screen flashed green, and a massive directory of hidden folders flooded the display. Fielding leaned in close eyes, narrowing as he clicked through the primary financial ledgers. He was a shark picking up the scent of blood, and Preston had left behind an absolute ocean of it. Fielding opened a master spreadsheet, and with each line he scrolled past. His face grew a shade paler. The numbers looked like noise at first glance, but Fielding knew exactly how to read what the corporate deception was hiding. "This isn't an investment firm," Fielding whispered, his voice unsteady with a mixture of professional disbelief and raw disgust. "This is a large, carefully orchestrated Ponzi scheme. Preston hasn't been a legitimate banker in over 4 years. He has been systematically cannibalizing his own clients." Fielding jabbed a shaking finger at a column of red figures buried deep inside a nested folder labeled as offshore holding accounts. Preston had embezzled over $12 million from his top-tier investors, skimming enormous percentages off their portfolios and routing the stolen capital through a dozen untraceable shell companies in the Cayman Islands to bankroll his lavish, unsustainable lifestyle. But the house of cards was finally coming down. Fielding pulled up a series of internal memos, frantic, desperate emails exchanged between Preston and his chief financial officer. The Securities and Exchange Commission had flagged significant discrepancies across multiple quarterly filings. Worse, a specialized task force from the Federal Bureau of Investigation had formally requested a full audit of Drummond Capital Investments. Federal agents were already circling the firm. The net was closing fast. I stared at the glowing screen as the structural blueprints of Preston's lies became completely transparent. The Drummonds weren't just facing a corporate scandal. They were staring down total, catastrophic ruin. Rupert opened another directory labeled Personal Estate. The files inside laid bare the brutal reality of their private finances. The sprawling mansion in Indian Hill, the imported luxury vehicles, the expensive charity galas, all of it was a meticulously constructed illusion. The estate was heavily mortgaged with not a single payment made in 7 months. A final foreclosure notice had been issued just 3 weeks ago. Their private accounts were completely overdrawn. Every available line of credit was maxed out. Preston and Vivian were entirely bankrupt, without enough liquid cash to cover their utility bills, let alone fight off a massive federal indictment and repay $12 million in stolen client funds. There is only one clean, untraceable asset left anywhere in their orbit. Fielding said, pulling up the trust documents Carolyn had created. It's Natalie's $8 million inheritance. It matured exactly 14 days ago, but there's a significant legal wall in their way. Carolyn engineered this trust to be completely bulletproof. Preston can't simply move those funds into a joint account. The bank requires Natalie's physical signature verified by a public notary to authorize the release of the principal. Without her explicit willing consent, he cannot touch a single dime. The horrifying mechanics of the trap were now fully illuminated. Preston was drowning in criminal debt. He demanded the money. Natalie refused and threatened to expose him. So he and his mother fell back on a sinister contingency. They poisoned her, branded her a suicidal addict, and locked her inside a private medical fortress that Vivian controlled outright. They were keeping my daughter heavily sedated, while Preston used his medical proxy to file for a hostile financial conservatorship. Once a judge declared Natalie mentally incompetent to manage her own affairs, Preston would be handed absolute legal control over her estate. He could sidestep the signature requirement, drain the $8 million payoff his most dangerous creditors, and muzzle the federal auditors before the FBI came knocking. My daughter was the only thing standing between Preston Drummond and a federal prison cell. Rupert suddenly raised his hand, cutting us off mid-sentence. What Gerald was about to uncover would not just confirm his worst fears. It would reveal a betrayal so calculated. It would take everything he had, not to walk straight through a wall. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If the people closest to someone you loved had been quietly working against them for months, would you move fast and loud or slow and invisible? Rupert was tunneling through a concealed partition on the drive, a secure folder camouflaged as routine system junk. "Take a look at this," he said. Voice low, eyes locked on the screen. Preston ran voice-activated dictation software for his personal notes. The application captures ambient audio, automatically caches those files to the local drive before pushing them up to the cloud. I found one that had been buried and scheduled for deletion. The timestamp puts it 3 days back, 20 minutes before Natalie's panicked voicemail hit your phone. He boosted the speaker volume and hit play. Static flooded the warehouse, then, without warning, a glass detonating against a hardwood floor. "I am not signing a single thing, Preston." It was Natalie's voice blazing through the speakers without a tremor of surrender in it. "Then every word out of your mouth has been a lie? I pulled those offshore statements myself. I know what you did. I know who you stole from, and I know how much. You gutted those people's accounts, and now you want me to hand over my mother's money so you can stay out of a federal courtroom. That is never going to happen." Preston's voice answered a coiled, shaking fury wrapped in cold calculation. "You have no idea how far this reaches, Natalie. The moment I fall, every single one of us goes down with me. The estate gets seized. We lose it all, every last thing. You are my wife, and you have an obligation to close this gap before those auditors walk through the door Monday morning." "My obligation," Natalie shot back, her voice steady with iron resolve, "is not to help you bury a crime. I'm ringing Fielding at first light to put a freeze on every account I own. Then I'm calling my father. I'm filing the divorce papers, Preston. I am walking out of this house and I am reclaiming my life. You and your mother need help that I cannot give you. A violent eruption of noise swallowed her last word. Something heavy slammed against a wall with a force that rattled the recording. Natalie's voice cut off in a sharp, strangled gasp. Then Preston's voice, now stripped down to a quiet and predatory hiss. You are not going anywhere, Natalie. Sit down, pick up the pen, and sign those authorization forms, or I promise you will not leave this house. The playback died. A ringing, suffocating quiet filled the warehouse. I couldn't move. I stood there with my eyes fixed on the screen, the sound of my daughter's terror still vibrating in the air around me. She hadn't folded. She hadn't given him an inch. She had drawn a line in front of his entire criminal operation and dared him to cross it, and he had answered by throwing her against a wall and leaving those marks on her skin. When she'd barricaded herself and called me for help, I had been running power tools in my garage, completely insulated from what was happening to her. Because he couldn't break her with threats, Preston moved to the next option. He poisoned her. This was no longer a financial theory pieced together from documents. It was the architectural drawing of an attempted murder. Preston and Vivian had engineered the deliberate erasure of my daughter's mind, and they'd put a price tag on it, $8 million. I reached down and closed my hand around the tactical crowbar resting on the folding table. Cold forged steel. Heavy and real. I turned to face the warehouse door, every muscle in my face set hard. I held enough evidence to gut their finances. What remained was to breach their walls and bring my girl out of there. I walked out of that abandoned space with Rupert and Fielding already deep into the mechanics of the final financial injunctions. The drive back to the motel was nothing like the one that had brought me there. The fog of uncertainty that had been sitting on my chest for days had lifted, completely replaced by something cold, clean, and precise. The financial evidence was locked down. Now the live piece of the operation demanded my attention. Back inside my motel room, deadbolt-thrown blackout curtains sealed tight against the night, I settled at the scratched wooden desk. The laptop threw a pale glow across the walls. I retrieved the secondary receiver Delia had passed to me, wired it into the machine, and let the software initialize. It began scanning for the encrypted transmissions from the micro cameras I'd installed throughout the Drummond estate. Several seconds of white noise. Then the image resolved the display, splitting cleanly into two live feeds. The first showed Vivian's parlor lying empty in silver moonlight. The second gave me a bird's-eye perspective straight down into Preston's mahogany-paneled home office, the ceiling vent camera, delivering every inch of the room without obstruction. The two of them occupied the leather armchairs facing each other across the low table. Between them sat a crystal decanter of aged bourbon and two heavy crystal glasses. Preston poured his movements, unhurried, the tension that had radiated off him at the office entirely absent. The rattled, perspiring man from earlier in the day had been replaced by something worse, a comfortable, self-satisfied predator who considered the threat fully neutralized. Vivian lifted her glass, rotating it slowly, watching the liquid catch the light before she drank. She had draped herself in a deep emerald silk robe and wore the expression of someone who had just settled a mildly inconvenient piece of business. I sealed the headphones over my ears. The parabolic microphones brought the room in close, the clink of glass, the breath of the heating system through the ducts. I sat motionless, waiting for the cracks. The hospital was managed without a single misstep. Vivian said, her tone as relaxed as if she were recapping a dinner reservation. Dr. Colton is completely ours. He submitted the toxicology filing on the timeline I specified, leaning hard into the alcohol and anxiety medication combination. He sidestepped the sulfite protocol altogether, logging her airway restriction as a severe panic response rather than anaphylaxis. Preston, the story holds from every angle. Preston responded with a low chuckle, the sound of a man enjoying his own relief, and it clenched every muscle along my jaw until my back teeth ground together. He settled deeper into the chair, drink in hand. "I won't pretend I wasn't scared, Mother. The moment she turned up those offshore records when she said she was calling Fielding to lock the fund and then calling her father, I genuinely thought we were done. With the SEC already sniffing around and the auditors due Monday, if she had walked out carrying $8 million, the firm would have been in freefall before the week ended." Vivian dismissed it with a single unhurried wave of her hand, returning her glass to the table. "You have always buckled under pressure, Preston. It is a weakness. When something threatens the structure of this family, you don't flinch, you remove it. Natalie believed that a nursing certificate and a trust fund put her on equal footing with us. All we did was clarify the actual power arrangement. I sat in my motel chair with both hands clamped onto the desk edge, the blood draining from my knuckles. The offhandedness of her contempt turned my stomach. My daughter reduced to a nuisance they'd tidied away." Preston turned his glass in slow circles, watching the bourbon shift. "What I still can't get past," he said quietly, almost to himself, "is the way she looked at me in that bedroom. When I showed her the wine, the pills already dissolved in it, the expression on her face, like she was seeing me for the very first time." Vivian's scoff came out jagged and raw, cutting straight through her composure. "She clawed at us like an animal cornered in a drain," she said, her voice sliding into something uglier and quieter. Embarrassing, honestly. I took hold of her arms, got her flat on the hardwood floor, and she was still thrashing, still screaming at you to stop, still begging. I kept my grip on her wrists and pressed down until the fight went out of her limbs completely. Wild things require that kind of handling, Preston. You cannot reason with them. You subdue them. I kept her locked in place while you brought the glass to her lips and worked that mixture into her. Every molecule of air left my body. A shudder rolled through me so violently it felt structural, like a building shifting off its foundation. I had just listened to a mother recount in a measured and conversational voice how she had held my daughter to the floor while her son emptied poison past her lips. Those bruises on Natalie's arms, those deep, dark impressions that looked like fingers, they had come from Vivian. She had pinned my child down. She had kept her immobile and watched her choke on a substance she had been allergic to since childhood. We had to make sure she took enough to justify the psychiatric hold. Vivian kept smoothing a crease from her silk robe. If we had simply called the police and claimed she was unstable, she would have denied every word. She would have told them about your embezzlement. We needed her completely incoherent, violently ill, and unmistakably suicidal. By engineering the overdose, we destroyed her credibility entirely. We manufactured the perfect, undeniable physical evidence of a severe mental collapse. Preston nodded in vigorous agreement. And the brilliant part is that her devoted father swallowed the whole performance without question. Gerald was standing right there in that hospital corridor looking like a broken, beaten man. I handed him the legal proxy and he just completely caved. He loaded up his truck and fled to northern Michigan to grieve in some cabin. He will not be anywhere near the city to get in our way. Vivian smiled, lifting her glass. We silenced her. Preston, a suicidal, addicted wife locked inside a secure psychiatric ward, carries absolutely zero credibility. Even if she wakes up and tries to tell the nurses about your missing millions, it will be logged instantly as a paranoid delusion born from her chemical dependency. We own her story. We own her medical care. And most importantly, we own her estate. Preston glanced at his heavy gold wristwatch, the metal catching the glow of the office lights. The paperwork is ready. Once the judge signs off on Friday, we pull the plug on her trust, and the clinic keeps her sedated for the next 10 years. Nobody will ever believe a junkie. Preston's final chilling words hung in the thick, stagnant air of that motel room. The sheer cruelty of it pressed down on me like dead weight. I stared at the glowing monitor, its blue light throwing long, harsh shadows across the scarred surface of the wooden desk. The mechanical fury that had ignited in me earlier was no longer a smoldering ember. It had compressed itself into something far denser, something absolute and unbreakable. I reached out with a steady hand and struck a single key, cutting the recording. The silence that rushed back in was total, but my mind was running at full throttle. I had the confession. I had the brutal, undeniable truth of what they had done to my only child. The truth was a weapon, yes, but it was still in its scabbard. If I moved recklessly, if I let my rage do the driving, Preston would slide right through my hands. I needed professional surgical precision to corner him, but holding the truth and deploying it are two entirely different things in the eyes of the law. I needed Fielding. I grabbed the burner phone, dialed his direct line, and told him to get to the warehouse command center without delay. I packed the laptop, the hard drive, and the audio files into my canvas duffel bag and left the surveillance equipment running. I drove back to the Mill Creek Industrial Corridor, dark, empty streets, strobing past my windshield like a fever dream. When I shouldered open the heavy metal door of the second-floor office, Rupert and Fielding were already there. I skipped the pleasantries. I plugged the laptop into the main monitor and let the audio file play. I watched the color drain rapidly from Fielding's face as Vivian described holding my daughter down. I watched Rupert's jaw go tight, his hands curling into hard fists on the folding table. When the recording clicked off, neither man said a word for a long stretch. The sheer, calculated malice of the Drummond family had seized the room completely. Fielding slowly removed his glasses, pressing his fingers against the bridge of his nose with a trembling hand. "Gerald!" Fielding began, his voice unusually quiet, scrubbed of all his usual courtroom authority. "This changes the entire landscape, but it also collapses their timeline. If Preston has already filed the paperwork, we are burning daylight." Fielding opened his briefcase and drew out a thick stack of legal precedents. He laid out the grim, terrifying mechanics of the maneuver Preston was executing. "It is called an emergency ex parte conservatorship," Fielding said, leaning his weight against the table. "It is a legal provision originally designed to protect vulnerable individuals who pose an immediate danger to themselves. Preston has weaponized it perfectly. He is bypassing standard notification periods by claiming Natalie's fake suicide attempt constitutes a severe, life-threatening medical crisis." Fielding spread the documents across the table, tapping his gold pen against the dense legal text. "Preston has submitted completely falsified medical records from the emergency room. He has the rapidly processed toxicology report, showing the lethal mixture of sedatives and alcohol. And most damaging of all, he has the sworn, documented testimony of Dr. Colton, the corrupt emergency room physician Vivian paid off. That doctor has legally certified that Natalie suffers from profound psychiatric instability and severe chemical dependency. The hearing is set for tomorrow morning, Friday, at exactly 9. It will be held behind closed doors in a private judicial chamber to protect the patient's privacy. If the judge brings that gavel down and signs the order, Preston will be handed absolute, irrevocable legal control over every aspect of Natalie's existence." A cold, paralyzing dread crept up my spine. "What does absolute control actually mean, Fielding?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "It means you cease to exist as her father in the eyes of the law," Fielding said, meeting my gaze directly. "Preston will have the legal authority to dictate her medical treatment, meaning he can keep her permanently committed and heavily sedated inside Vivian's black site clinic. He will control who may visit her, meaning he will legally bar you from ever setting foot in that facility. You will never be permitted to see your daughter again. And on the financial side, he will gain total access to her $8 million trust fund. He will drain every single penny by Monday afternoon, wire the stolen funds to his offshore creditors, and bury his massive $12 million embezzlement completely. He walks away a free, wealthy man, and Natalie spends the rest of her natural life trapped in a chemical prison. The crushing weight of Fielding's words settled over that dim warehouse like a shroud. Rupert watched me carefully, his posture coiled, clearly bracing for an explosion. He expected me to cave in the monitor, to heave the heavy metal table across the room, or to break apart in blind, helpless rage. I did not yell. I did not touch a single thing in that room. The deep, freezing fury in my chest simply crystallized into pure, tactical execution. I stood up slowly. I reached for my dark canvas jacket draped over the folding chair and slid my arms in with calm deliberation. I fastened the buttons with methodical, unhurried precision. "Rupert," I said, my voice stripped of every trace of panic, "I need you to reach out to your federal contacts right now. You mentioned the Federal Bureau of Investigation had a specialized financial crimes division circling Preston's firm. I want you to call the highest-ranking agent you know on that task force. You are going to use the cloned hard drive data as bait. Tell them you have absolute, undeniable proof of a $12 million corporate embezzlement scheme, complete with offshore routing numbers and internal communications. Tell them the whole structure is collapsing and the primary suspect is a serious flight risk, but do not hand over the files yet. Tell them they have to meet us tomorrow morning at the county courthouse if they want the full package delivered to them on a silver platter." Rupert smiled slowly, a dark, predatory gleam surfacing in his weathered eyes. He pulled his phone from his leather jacket, already moving through his encrypted contact list. "Consider it done, Gerald. They will bring an entire tactical team for a bust of this size." I turned back to Fielding. "Fielding, you are going to draft a counter-petition for immediate medical emancipation built around the audio confession and the structural proof of Vivian's shadow ownership of that psychiatric clinic. We are going to walk straight into that private, closed-door judicial chamber tomorrow morning at exactly 9. We are not going there to stop the hearing. We are going to let Preston construct his perfect little legal fortress right in front of the judge. We will let him present his fabricated medical records. We will let him spin his tragic, heartbreaking lies. And then we are going to lock the doors from the inside. And we are going to absolutely annihilate him." We spent the rest of Thursday night converting the abandoned industrial warehouse into a tightly synchronized tactical command center. The air was thick with the smell of bitter black coffee and the electric hum of processors running at their absolute limits. I watched Fielding pace relentlessly across the concrete floor, sorting the printed documents into distinct, lethal legal categories, meticulously stitching Preston's fraudulent emergency room charts to Vivian's hidden corporate ownership records. Rupert stayed locked onto his encrypted monitor running the digital back channels and holding a live line to his federal contacts. This was not a simple defense strategy for a conservatorship hearing. We were erecting a federal RICO case from the ground up, each charge placed with the same structural precision a demolition crew uses when wiring a building to come down exactly right. Not a single seam could show weakness. One overlooked legal gap, and Preston's expensive attorneys would pour through it like water. Everything hinged, though, on the physical evidence Glenda was putting herself at serious risk to retrieve. The warehouse's heavy metal door ground open at exactly 2 in the morning. A courier working privately for Rupert walked into the glare of the overhead fluorescence arms wrapped around a small, insulated biometric transport cooler. He had come straight from a covert handoff with Glenda, an empty commuter parking lot sitting 3 miles beyond the outer boundary of the Whispering Ridge Wellness Retreat. Fielding grabbed the cooler and cracked the magnetic seals open. 3 pristine vials of Natalie's uncompromised blood lay inside, nestled in dry ice, perfectly preserved. Fielding moved fast, handing them off to an independent forensic toxicologist, a specialist he kept on permanent retainer for high-stakes corporate cases. We paid a steep premium to jump the standard lab queue entirely and push for immediate, conclusive chemical results. 3 hours of grinding, suffocating suspense followed. I wore a track into the warehouse floor boots, striking concrete in a slow, hollow rhythm. My mind locked on the image of my daughter restrained in that cold hospital bed, while chemicals ate through her mind. Then Fielding's encrypted phone buzzed against the folding table. He picked up, held the line in dead silence for 60 seconds, and set it down with one firm, deliberate nod. The toxicology report Dr. Colton filed with the hospital, Fielding said, his voice carrying a low, dark resonance, is a fabrication from top to bottom. Colton had put on record that Natalie went down from a heavy combination of generic Xanax and alcohol, that her respiratory failure traced directly to those substances, hitting her existing sulfite allergy. The independent lab told a completely different story. The compound actually flooding your daughter's system right now has nothing to do with Xanax, Gerald. What they used was an extremely potent clinical variant of Rohypnol, flunitrazepam, a rapid-acting central nervous system depressant, with almost no legitimate path to acquisition outside specialized medical authorization. Vivian did not simply knock her out. She deployed a chemical restraint that belongs in severe psychiatric lockdown protocols. There is nothing ambiguous about what that means. It is hard physical proof of deliberate, premeditated poisoning. In one stroke, Preston and Vivian had moved themselves from corporate criminals into attempted murderers. Those forged emergency room documents were no longer just a cover story. They had become a signed record of exactly what they did. While that realization was still settling over the room, Rupert's satellite uplink began chiming in a fast, insistent loop. He had punched through to a secure, closed network channel, connecting directly to Supervisory Special Agent Farrow, heading the FBI's elite financial crimes division. Rupert had pushed a tightly compressed, heavily encrypted file across a hand-selected slice of what we had pulled off Preston's cloned hard drive. Enough to prove the offshore embezzlement was real. Not enough to hand over our full position. Rupert hit the speakerphone and tilted back in his folding chair. The voice that came through was low and commanding, carrying the unmistakable edge of a man who had just smelled blood. 8 months, the agent said, cutting straight through any greeting. That is how long my division has been trying to break apart the shell companies wrapped around Drummond Capital Investments. Preston Drummond has his client money buried under layer after layer of international banking architecture. We had proof the accounts were hemorrhaging, but the exit points stayed invisible. What you just handed us cuts straight through years of forensic accounting dead ends. The metadata checks out completely. Every analyst on my task force is staring at a textbook $12 million Ponzi implosion, and nobody in this room is breathing normally right now. He went quiet for a moment, keyboards clattering somewhere behind him. I need everything else on that drive, Rupert. The master ledgers, the decryption keys for the Cayman Islands accounts. Give me those and I can have a federal arrest warrant in hand before dawn. Rupert's eyes moved to mine, one eyebrow lifting a silent question. I closed the distance to the microphone and let the old, cold discipline of a man who built things for a living come through in my voice. Every bite comes to you, Agent Farrow. I said, level and unhurried. But no arrest warrant touches anyone before 9:30 this morning. Preston Drummond walks into a private conservatorship proceeding at the county courthouse at 9. His play to strip my daughter's trust fund out from under her. Post your tactical team at the entrance to the judicial chambers. Hold them there until I have finished taking his case apart in front of the judge. Once that is done, everything on the drive is yours." A low, slow whistle came across the line. "We will have people in that corridor, Gerald. Try not to make it ugly." The call dropped, and the warehouse went absolutely still. Every component of the trap was in position. The charges laid the lines, run the perimeter sealed. Nothing remained but to let the clock run down to morning. I left Rupert and Fielding bent over their legal briefs and pointed the car back toward the roadside motel as the first thin wash of gray began seeping into the Friday sky along the eastern edge of the city. The wind had finally given out, leaving behind a cold that just sat there pressing in from all sides. My room was dim, the bathroom fixture throwing a weak, stuttering light across the tile. I peeled off this dark tactical gear I had been wearing since the Drummond estate. The shower ran scalding, and I stood under it long enough to let the fatigue, the grime, and the accumulated weight of the past 3 days circle down the drain. The version of me that had been walking around raw with grief needed to stay in that drain too. I toweled off and unzipped the garment bag I had carried from home. A sharp, meticulously tailored navy suit waited inside the armor I used to wear when negotiating massive commercial construction contracts. I put it on with the same deliberate care I once brought to a pre-bid walkthrough. Collar buttoned, precisely silk tie, squared and centered jacket settled across my shoulders. I stood in front of the cracked mirror over the motel sink and took a long, steady look. The lost old man who had stumbled into that hospital corridor days ago was gone. Looking back was the project manager, measured, patient, and fully prepared for the final inspection. The heavy oak doors of the county courthouse swallowed the street noise, entirely sealing the private judicial chambers in a pressurized quiet. Inside that room, a performance was already underway. Judge Warren Calloway, 30 years behind family court benches, sharp-eyed and unreadable, presided from the raised mahogany bench. Below him at the plaintiff's table, Preston and Vivian Drummond were giving the most important audition of their lives. Conservative dark clothing cut to broadcast grief and propriety. Preston's posture was folded inward, shoulders rolled, chin down, a crumpled white tissue balled in both hands. At timed intervals, he pressed it to the outer corners of his eyes, the devastated husband rendered in meticulous detail. Vivian sat close beside him, one hand resting on his arm with studied tenderness, the composed, heartbroken mother sorrow worn like a tailored garment. "Your Honor." Preston's voice fractured on cue as he turned toward the bench. "Being here today is one of the most painful experiences of my life. I have exhausted every option trying to reach my wife. I have stood beside Natalie through the worst of it, believing she could pull herself back. The addiction has taken everything from her, including her judgment. She is not the person I built a life with. These substances have made her someone I barely recognize, erratic, self-destructive, a danger to no one more than herself." He drew a deliberate, unsteady breath and let the pause work on the room. 2 nights ago, she reached the bottom. She mixed a lethal quantity of sedatives and alcohol. I found her in time barely. If I had not gotten her to the emergency room when I did, she would be dead. What she needs now is long-term supervised psychiatric care, and she needs to be legally separated from her financial assets before they become the instrument of her destruction. Judge Calloway drew the thick legal binder toward him and worked through it with careful attention, the fabricated ER charts, the manipulated toxicology results, Dr. Colton's sworn affidavit. Every counterfeit document dovetailed perfectly with the next. I have gone through the medical records submitted by the attending physician. Judge Calloway said, his tone measured and grave. The toxicology findings paint a clear picture of severe life-threatening chemical dependency. It is never easy when a spouse is compelled to seek total legal authority over a partner's affairs. Mr. Drummond, the court, has considered the physical evidence of self-harm and the documented psychiatric instability before it, and finds the case for immediate intervention to be well established. The judge reached for his heavy black pen and unscrewed the gold cap. One stroke of his hand would dissolve my daughter's autonomy and hand Preston unchecked access to her $8 million trust fund. Final checkmate. At that precise instant, the massive brass handles of the courtroom doors caught, and the heavy oak panels swung hard on their hinges. The crack of solid wood against the rubber door stops rang through the sealed chamber like a rifle shot. I crossed the threshold, the tailored navy suit posture, rigid face cut from cold stone. I did not carry myself like a shattered father come to beg. I moved like a project manager stepping onto a condemned site scheduled for controlled demolition. Each leather heel landed against the polished marble with a steady, measured beat that filled the room. And I did not come in alone. Fielding was on my right, a thick leather briefcase locked in his grip, packed with every piece of our independent forensic evidence. Rupert held my left flank, posture relaxed, but eyes moving the unhurried scan of a man who has worked crime scenes for decades. Behind us, stepping in perfect unison, came two broad-shouldered federal agents in identical dark suits. Federal badges riding visibly at their belts, radiating an authority that needed no introduction. Supervisory Special Agent Farrow led them, his face giving away nothing at all. The effect on the plaintiff's table was immediate and physical. Preston went rigid, the crumpled tissue falling from his fingers. Every trace of manufactured suffering drained from his face, replaced in an instant by naked, undisguised terror. His knuckles bleached white against the table's edge, and his lungs simply stopped working. The performance he had constructed so carefully was coming apart in real time right in front of him. He understood in a fraction of a second what those federal badges represented: his offshore accounts blown open, his financial architecture exposed, his criminal scaffolding collapsed entirely. The fortified, invisible structure he had built around himself was gone, and the full light of federal prosecution was pouring in through the wreckage. Vivian's reaction was something else. The polished, aristocratic surface cracked hard, and what came through was something raw and cornered. She shoved back from the table, the wooden chair screaming against the marble. The color that flooded her face was a deep, furious red. "What is the meaning of this?" Her voice went shrill, bouncing off the high ceiling in jagged waves. One manicured finger leveled directly at my chest, the supportive mother act gone completely. "Your Honor, this man must be removed from this chamber at once. He has no legal standing here. He is consumed by grief, mentally unfit, and he is violently disrupting a sealed medical proceeding. This cannot be permitted to continue. He is completely out of his mind. He is delusional. He is trying to destroy a sensitive legal process designed to protect my daughter-in-law." Judge Calloway brought his gavel down against the sounding block, a single sharp crack that cut straight through Vivian's hysteria. "Order!" The word landed like a hammer blow, his voice carrying the full weight of 30 years on the bench. He looked down at us, brow drawn tight, plainly unsettled by the sudden breach of his sealed chambers, and directed the gavel toward our group. "Sir, these doors were closed for a reason. You do not simply force your way into a private proceeding. State your name and explain this interruption." I did not raise my voice over the fading echo of Vivian's outburst. I did not slam anything or posture for the room. I moved forward with a cold, unhurried certainty that was more unnerving than anger. I stopped exactly 3 feet from the plaintiff's table and let Preston see me looking directly at him. The ruin was already visible in his face, the wide, sweating panic of a man watching the ground give way. Then I raised my eyes to the bench and met the judge's hard, questioning stare. My voice came out smooth, flat, and dense with the weight of documented truth. Your Honor. I said the words, cutting the silence cleanly. My name is Gerald Whitlow. I am the father of the woman being committed here today. I have not come to obstruct a medical hearing. I am here to place on record a premeditated kidnapping, a deliberate chemical poisoning, and a $12 million federal fraud. The silence that followed was the kind that presses against the walls. Judge Calloway set the gavel down slowly, his eyes tracking between me, the federal agents, and the trembling pair at the plaintiff's table. Preston looked as though the marble had dissolved beneath his shoes. His mouth opened, but produced only a dry, airless sound. Vivian stared at me with pure, burning hatred, her chest rising and falling fast, fingers gouging the edge of the table hard enough to leave marks. Your Honor, Fielding said, moving forward with the controlled ease of a man who has argued in front of difficult judges before. He set his briefcase on the evidence table and snapped the brass locks. The sound was clean and final in the quiet room. My name is Arthur Fielding, financial attorney for Natalie Drummond. We are appearing to contest this conservatorship on the basis of independent evidence demonstrating that the plaintiff systematically falsified medical records to execute a hostile financial takeover. Judge Calloway leaned forward, the lines around his eyes tightening into something harder than skepticism. Those are exceptionally serious allegations, Counselor, he said, his voice dropping a register. You are charging the plaintiff with manipulating a sealed medical proceeding. Whatever documentation you have brought had better be sufficient to carry a claim of that weight. Fielding did not waver for a moment. He drew a sealed manila folder from the briefcase and passed it to the bailiff, who carried it straight up to the bench. That folder contains an independent forensic toxicology report, Your Honor, Fielding said, his voice holding steady and even. We obtained a legally clean blood sample from Natalie Drummond early this morning, collected by a nurse at the Whispering Ridge Wellness Retreat. The sample went directly to an independent forensic toxicologist, no contact with the local laboratories the plaintiff controls. The findings stand in direct contradiction to every chart Mr. Drummond submitted. Preston sank in his chair, the careful architecture of his medical trap cracking open around him. The original report claims she went down from Xanax and alcohol. Fielding continued, moving steadily before the bench. The independent analysis tells a completely different story. The compound actually present in the patient's bloodstream is not Xanax at all. It is a highly potent clinical variant of flunitrazepam, a powerful central nervous system depressant with almost no legitimate path to acquisition outside specialized psychiatric authorization. We have also included Natalie Drummond's complete lifetime medical history. Page 4 documents a severe, long-standing allergy to sulfites. Dr. Colton deliberately set that documented allergy aside in order to prop up a false account of a panic-induced asthma attack. Judge Calloway worked through the independent laboratory findings with gathering speed, his brow pulling deeper with each page. He lifted his eyes to Preston, and whatever neutrality had been there before was gone, replaced by a cold, penetrating stare. Mr. Drummond, the judge said, his voice landing like a whip crack. Are you aware that fabricating medical records to obtain a conservatorship constitutes serious felony fraud? Preston's mouth opened. His polished banker's composure had shattered entirely. Your Honor, I had no idea, he choked out. The doctors told me she took those pills. I was only acting to protect my wife. I am simply a husband trying to save his family. That is a lie. I said it without volume, but it cut him off completely. I moved past Fielding and walked to the low wooden railing dividing the gallery from the legal floor. I reached into my jacket pocket and brought out the burner phone. My voice stayed low. The room came to me. Your Honor, Preston and Vivian Drummond did not merely forge documents. They deliberately and violently poisoned my daughter inside her own home to ensure her silence, and I have the recording that proves it." Vivian was on her feet again in an instant, face convulsed with panic. "This is an absolute outrage," she shrieked, the sound ricocheting off every surface. "He is manufacturing evidence. A closed court cannot permit this unstable man to play unauthorized recordings. He is violating our constitutional privacy." "Sit down, Mrs. Drummond." Judge Calloway drove the gavel down with enough force to make the bench shudder. "One more out, and I will hold you in contempt and instruct the bailiffs to place you in restraints. Proceed, Mr. Whitlow. This court will hear exactly what you have brought through those doors." I crossed to the court clerk's desk and lifted the auxiliary audio cable. I plugged it directly into the phone. I did not look at Preston. I did not look at Vivian. My eyes stayed on Judge Calloway, and his stayed on me. I found the recovered audio file and pressed play. The raw, static hiss of the hidden recording poured into the hushed courtroom. The sound of glass exploding against a hardwood floor made Preston flinch hard in his seat. Then the voice of Vivian Drummond rolled through the judicial chamber, every trace of refinement stripped away. She fought like a stray dog. Vivian's recorded voice curled with venom, and the judge's eyes went wide with something close to horror. It was pathetic. When I held her down against the floor, she was thrashing and screaming for you to stop. She was begging, but I kept her wrists locked. I drove my fingers into her arms until she couldn't move an inch. "You have to be firm with feral things, Preston. You have to break their spirit before you can leash them." I held her completely still while you forced the glass to her mouth and poured that mixture down her throat. I watched every drop of color leave Preston's face. He had the look of a condemned man watching the executioner's hand find the lever. Vivian collapsed back into her chair, both hands flying to cover her mouth, gasping, chest heaving, while the audio went on dismantling every lie she had ever told. We erased her voice, Preston." The recorded Vivian's cruel laughter spread through the courtroom. "A suicidal, addicted wife locked in a secure psychiatric ward carries no credibility whatsoever. If she wakes up and starts talking about your missing millions, it gets logged as a paranoid delusion. We own her story. We own her medical care. And most importantly, we own her estate." The recording moved toward its most damning moment. Then Preston's own voice filled the room, smug, unhurried, entirely certain of himself. "The paperwork is ready. Once the judge signs it, we pull the plug on her trust. The clinic keeps her a vegetable for the next 10 years. Nobody will ever believe a junkie." I pulled the cable free. Silence descended like a stone. Judge Calloway sat without moving, his face a mask of cold, contained fury. "In 30 years on this bench, I have never been confronted with malice of this depth," he said. "You attempted to weaponize this court against an innocent woman. The emergency proxy is hereby revoked. This court grants full emergency guardianship to Gerald Whitlow. Go bring your daughter home." Before Preston could absorb the loss of the $8 million supervisory special agent, Farrow stepped forward. "Preston Drummond," he said, badge already in hand. "You are under arrest for wire fraud and attempted murder." The polished silver handcuffs snapped around Preston's wrists with a sharp metallic click that rang across the stunned chamber. Supervisory Special Agent Farrow did not slow down, his voice moving through the silence with the flat, unyielding weight of federal authority. "You have the right to remain silent." Farrow recited his rights, his grip firmly locking Preston's arms behind his back. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Hi, you are being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, criminal conspiracy, and the attempted murder of Natalie Drummond. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Do you understand these rights as I have stated them?" Preston did not answer right away. His knees buckled completely expensive Italian leather shoes skidding across the smooth marble floor. He would have gone all the way down if the second federal agent hadn't caught him by the shoulder and hauled him back upright. The arrogant, untouchable financial predator who had strolled into this chamber barely 20 minutes ago was nowhere to be found. What remained was a shaking, weeping coward hyperventilating in a tailored suit, the crushing mass of federal charges finally squeezing the air from his chest. His eyes swept the room in wide, frantic arcs from Judge Calloway's ice-cold expression to the stone faces of the agents bracketing him. "Wait!" Preston suddenly gasped, the sound thin and desperate. "Wait, please! You have to listen to me!" I did not want to hurt her. I never wanted to hurt Natalie. I was only trying to fix the accounts. The money was supposed to be temporary, a short-term correction for the market losses. The violence, the drugs, locking her away in that place, none of that was my idea. The cowardice of it was absolute. As the federal agents tightened their hold to march him toward the heavy oak doors, Preston twisted violently in their grip and turned toward his mother. What came next was a desperate, self-serving shriek that filled every corner of the chamber. It was her. Preston screamed, spit flying, as he aimed his cuffed hands awkwardly at Vivian. She designed the entire plan. She found the clinic. She paid off Dr. Colton. She crushed those pills and made me dissolve them in the wine. I did not want to do any of it. She held Natalie down against the floor. You heard it on the recording. She did it. She drove me to it. I am the one who was manipulated here. She controlled me. The courtroom fractured into total chaos. Vivian Drummond, the polished matriarch of Indian Hill society, a woman who had spent a lifetime constructing an image of untouchable aristocratic perfection, simply snapped. The refined facade did not just crack. It came apart in every direction at once. "You pathetic, worthless little worm." The sound that tore out of Vivian was guttural and barely recognizable as a human voice. She lunged forward, covering the distance between them with terrifying speed. Before the agents could react, she drew her right arm back and caught Preston across the face with a vicious, open-handed slap. The crack of it landed like a pistol shot. Preston stumbled backward with a cry, a vivid red mark blooming instantly across his cheek. "You blame me!" Vivian's chest was heaving, her eyes lit with a wild, furious madness. "I spent my entire life cleaning up your wretched, incompetent disasters. I built this family. I shielded our name while you gambled it away like a reckless fool. I did what was necessary to save us from the wreckage of your stupidity." The assault was the final threshold. Judge Calloway hammered his gavel repeatedly, ordering the bailiffs to restore order, though the command was already unnecessary. The heavy-set bailiff posted at the door had started moving the moment the slap landed. He crossed the marble floor in 3 long strides, wrapped both arms around Vivian's waist, and drove her hard against the plaintiff's table. Vivian thrashed and kicked, screaming obscenities that shredded every last fragment of her cultivated dignity. The bailiff wrenched her arms behind her back and produced his own set of steel cuffs. "Vivian Drummond," the bailiff announced, voice straining over her breathless, frantic screaming. "You are under arrest for false imprisonment, aggravated assault, and attempted murder. Stop resisting." She did not stop. She fought with the wild, cornered energy of something that had run out of exits, thrashing against the woodwork, hammering her expensive heels against the table legs. Her immaculately styled hair was destroyed, matted in damp, tangled ropes across her face. The designer silk dress she had selected for her moment of triumph was twisted and rumpled beyond recognition. The agents and bailiffs hauled both of them upright, wrists locked in cold steel. The physical struggle was finished, but the verbal war had only ignited. As they were forced down the central aisle, Preston and Vivian turned on each other completely. The toxic, parasitic architecture of their bond was on full display for every person in that room. "I gave you everything!" Vivian roared, fighting against the bailiff's grip with every step. "You are a failure, Preston. A complete, absolute failure. You destroyed our family name. You destroyed my life. I hope you spend the rest of it rotting in a federal cell." "Hi! You forced me into this!" Preston sobbed back the words, breaking apart, as the agents pushed him toward the exit. "You controlled every piece of my life from the beginning. You made me into this. You are a monster. You are the one who ruined me." They were dragged from the chamber, their voices carrying hatred down the long marble corridors of the county courthouse, until the heavy oak doors swung shut and cut off the sound entirely. The ruin of the Drummond family was complete. They had entered this building as wealthy, untouchable elites, certain they could bend the law around my child and walk out free. They were leaving in handcuffs, their fortune exposed as a criminal construction, their reputations gone beyond any recovery, and their freedom permanently surrendered. Decades in federal prison waited for them, and they would consume every remaining moment blaming each other for what they had built together and destroyed together. I stood without moving beside the wooden railing, watching the heavy doors ease back into their frames. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not say a single word to either of them as they were marched past me in absolute disgrace. There was no joy in what had just happened. No triumphant surge, no sense of celebration. Watching their lives collapse did not erase a single bruise from my daughter's skin, and it gave back nothing of the terror she had endured. The long nightmare had finally run its course. My one remaining purpose was making sure Natalie was safe and getting her back to the place where she belonged. I turned away from the heavy doors and found Rupert's eyes. "Let's go get my daughter," I said. The drive to the Whispering Ridge Wellness Retreat felt endless, even with Rupert pushing the vehicle to its limit along the winding highway. Supervisory Special Agent Farrow and his federal convoy tracked close behind us, in a column of unmarked black SUVs, lights strobing red and blue across the tree canopy above sirens held silent. The sprawling, isolated facility materialized through the tall pines, looking far less like a place of healing and far more like a structure engineered to keep the world permanently at bay. Rupert stood on the brakes and brought us to a stop directly in front of the glass entrance. We did not pause for the reception staff to wave us in. The federal agents entered with coordinated, overwhelming force. Whatever tranquil atmosphere the psychiatric ward had maintained dissolved on impact. Agents spread across the lobby, serving warrants and sealing every exit. The nursing staff who had operated for so long with quiet, shadow-granted authority went rigid with fear. Dr. Colton came through a back corridor with a pale, sweat-slicked face, demanding to know what was happening. Agent Farrow did not spare him a word of explanation. He simply pointed two of his men forward. They put the doctor against the reception desk and had handcuffs on his wrists in seconds. Fielding moved in just behind the agents, producing the emergency guardianship order signed by Judge Calloway and demanding the master key cards for the secure residential wing. I did not stand around waiting for the process to play out. My heart was hammering against my ribs as I pushed past the detained staff and walked hard down the corridor. I tracked the brass room numbers as I went jaw locked tight until I reached room 318 at the very end of the corridor. The door was magnetically sealed, but a federal agent stepped up and swiped a confiscated keycard. The lock released, and the heavy door swung open. The room was dim, wrapped in a pale half-light. The air carried antiseptic and sterile linen. I stepped inside, and the breath seized in my throat. There, on a narrow hospital bed, utterly motionless, was my daughter. She looked impossibly small and pale against the white sheets, frail in a way that cut straight through me. An IV line ran from her arm to a softly blinking monitor beside the bed, still slowly feeding the sedatives that had been holding her captive. Seeing her that way, stripped of all her vitality and reduced to a helpless prisoner, sent a fresh wave of grief through my chest, like a cold current. I crossed to the edge of the bed and went down on my knees. With hands that would not stop trembling, I reached out and eased a stray lock of hair away from her damp forehead. "Natalie," I whispered, my voice barely holding together. "Sweetheart, it's Dad. I'm right here." Her eyelids moved, struggling against the thick chemical weight pressing down on her mind. Slowly, painfully slowly, they opened, glazed and unfocused at first, fixed on the ceiling, before drifting down to settle on my face. Recognition broke through the sedation like a light through fog. Her lips parted, but the words wouldn't come. She managed to press my hand. I leaned forward until my forehead rested gently against hers. "I've got you, sweetheart," I whispered, and let my tears fall onto the white sheets. "We're going home. No one is ever going to touch you again." 1 month later, the bite of winter had given way entirely to spring. The vast Drummond estate, the house where Preston and Vivian had drawn up the plans to destroy my daughter, stood empty and dark behind padlocked gates. Federal authorities had seized the property and frozen every asset woven through their criminal enterprise. The fall of Indian Hill's most prominent family had dominated the news for weeks. The sheer scale of their arrogance had left the financial community in stunned silence. Preston Drummond, separated from his tailored suits and his practiced smirk, had entered guilty pleas on multiple counts of wire fraud, large-scale embezzlement, and conspiracy. He was in a federal penitentiary, looking at 25 years without the possibility of early parole. His mother Vivienne had fought the charges with a ferocious, blind fury, but the audio recording and the independent toxicology results were a wall she could not scale. She was facing 15 years for false imprisonment and attempted murder, her social standing permanently and completely erased. The $12 million corporate shortfall was fully accounted for, but Natalie's $8 million trust fund had never been touched, secured in an independent account solely in her name. The money was intact. More importantly, my daughter was intact. I stood on the back porch of my quiet home, a steaming mug of coffee in both hands, looking out over a sunlit garden where daffodils and purple hydrangeas had pushed up through the morning light. Natalie was in the center of the yard, seated in a wheelchair with a blanket across her lap, holding a cup of chamomile tea in both hands, taking small, careful sips while the morning sun warmed her face. The shadows beneath her eyes had retreated, and a color was returning to her cheeks that I hadn't seen in far too long. The residual damage from the poisoning was still releasing its hold on her body, but underneath it, something steady and determined was rising to fill the space. She glanced up from her tea and found me on the porch. She smiled. I lifted my mug in a quiet salute and smiled back. I stayed on the steps, watching the breeze move through the oak tree shading the yard, letting my mind travel back across the past month. A lifetime of laying concrete and aligning steel beams had given me one particular skill. I had always been able to look at a structure and find the rot in its foundation almost immediately. The Drummond family had raised their entire empire on crumbling bedrock layers of lies, manipulation, and compounding greed. They had convinced themselves that their money and their standing made them untouchable, sealed off from any consequences their cruelty might earn. They believed they could flatten anyone who stepped in front of them. What they had failed to calculate was the particular unbreakable strength that lives in a father who will not stop moving toward his child. I had not needed to match their violence or their deception. I hadn't thrown a punch. I hadn't fired a weapon. I had taken their own raw materials, every lie they told, every document they forged, every move they made, and constructed a trap around them, piece by piece, with cold patience and ruthless precision. Now those monsters were locked in iron cages of their own, making their empire reduced to rubble and their names beyond any redemption. If you have stayed with me this far, thank you. I mean that sincerely. This was not an easy story to carry, and I imagine it was not always easy to hear. What this took from Gerald was everything a man is not supposed to have: to spend his trust, his sleep, his sense of safety in his own family. What it gave back was the one thing that mattered: his daughter alive, sitting in a garden with color returning to her face. I believe God places a particular kind of strength inside a parent that they do not even know is there until the moment they have no other choice. Gerald found his, and he used every last ounce of it. Here is what I take from this story, and what I hope you carry with you. When something does not add up, do not talk yourself out of your instincts. Quiet, persistent doubt has saved more lives than loud confrontation ever has. If someone is trying to silence a person you love, the answer is not to get louder. It is to get smarter. Gather every piece of the truth before you move. Never underestimate what a father or any parent will do when their child's life is genuinely on the line. That is not sentiment. That is a force of nature. And finally, the people who build their security on lies are always eventually standing on nothing. Patience and truth are a foundation that holds. If this story moved, you leave a comment below and tell me what struck you most. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that justice is still possible, even when the odds look impossible. And if you have not already subscribed to Dad Revenge, there are more stories here, and every single one of them matters. Thank you for being here with me today. I will see you in the next one.